now I want to go through 7 common myths about good writing, especially academic writing that I think a lot of people have heard. Um, some of them you might notice we're kind of moving away from a little. Um, but some of them you might still have some experience with or have heard before. I find that different people have heard different ones, but these are 7 of the most common, and I'm going to go through a little bit of my experience with each of these. Number 1 is the paint by numbers myth. You might not remember paint by numbers because you're a little older now, you know, but when you were little, you painted those pictures. They were all sort of blocked off, you know, and if you painted the ones pink and the twos blue and the threes green, you did everything like you were supposed to. The picture just sort of filled in really nice because someone had already just drawn all the lines where they needed to be. So all you had to do was fill in the blanks in, you know, the right places, and the picture was beautiful, and you didn't have to work very hard. So the reason the myth is called this is because a lot of times we learn certain steps, I guess, or certain formulas that say, like, if you put the thesis here and the topic sentence here and the quote here and this here, then it'll be good when you get done. Or if you write your bubble map first and your outline next and you do things in this order, then that will make it turn out good. If you do things in this order or you put things in these places, like, it'll just be good. And the problem is that isn't always the case. One of the things we'll talk a lot about is that everybody's like processes and habits with writing can differ a lot. So not every method or every way of doing things works for everybody. And again, like, there's so many genres and styles that there's not really a formula. Like, just because you put, you know, this, you know, the thesis here or the topic sentence here, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be good. It's a lot more complicated than that. And that's one of the things that makes writing hard, is that there is no formula for how you're supposed to do it every time that makes it good. Myth number 2 is that writers only start writing when they have it figured out, especially good writers. We tend to assume that, like, a good writer just sort of drafts in their head. So there's no point in sitting down to write until you know exactly what you're going to say, right? Like, and sometimes I do that. I used to do that when I was in grad school all the time, where I would, and this was a decade or so ago, but I would really have to, like, I would have to know exactly how it was going to turn out in my head and have everything really planned out. So I would never start the paper. So this is something I know I struggle with, and I know I've had a lot of students struggle with the same thing, where they feel like if you're a good writer, you should just sit down and be able to do it. Like, it's all clear in your head before you sit down. But one of the things that I have learned is true is that sometimes going through the process of writing is how you figure out what you want to say. Like, you almost have to see it on the paper and hear it before you can really assess it and add on to it. And it doesn't really work like that. I don't know anyone who is a writer who just writes, and I'm not saying like a good enough draft for class. I'm talking about like writers who publish never just write things and then they're done. There's always multiple drafts. My graduate work has maybe 15 to 20 drafts, and a short story that I have that's actually in an anthology that's an award-winning short story was rejected like 9 times before it was accepted, and it has a lot of drafts. And it has like alternate endings for every single version, and that happens because it's a process. And I guess that kind of goes along with the perfect first drafts myth, you know, that like if you're a good writer, you just make amazing first drafts. And again, I don't mean good enough drafts. I mean that like good writers just, you know, magic happens when they sit down in front of the computer or the paper, and that's what makes them good writers, the fact that they don't have to try very hard. If you Google writing quotes, you will find that a lot of authors, a lot of their quotes about writing are about how much it sucks and how difficult it is, even for good writers. One of my favorite ones is that, you know, I hate writing, but I love to have written. I love the idea I get at the beginning and the feeling of being done and reading it back and being like, that's it, that's how I wanted it to sound. But the process of getting from A to B is sometimes pretty gut-wrenching and horrifying. Myth 4. Some got it, I don't. the genius fallacy. You know, we've all heard like the nature versus nurture thing, and I think too often, I don't know if people really believe, like buy into this wholeheartedly as much as it's an excuse, I guess, that if you don't think you're a good writer, it's a way to like hunker down in that and not try. I feel like you're welcome to disagree with me on that. But I do think that there's something to be said for there being some nature in it and some people just naturally having some strengths and weaknesses. But again, I think that it's more complicated than that. For instance, I think my story that goes along with this is that I was actually never that great at like my grades in reading and writing were always a little bit worse than science and math when I was a lot younger. Like we're talking like early elementary. But I ended up going into writing and things later on because I had to get good at it because when I was a kid, I had, this is my sad, awkward childhood story. I had a speech impediment, and it was really bad. Like I was like in speech therapy for like 10 years. And so when you're a kid with a speech problem, other people don't want to talk to you as much. So you end up doing a lot of talking to yourself. So I did a lot of just walking around alone and telling myself stories and coming up with characters and just being an all-around weird kid, you know? And I was also told that I should either sing or write things that I wanted to say. And you do not want to hear me sing. So I wrote out a lot of the things I was thinking and what I wanted to say. And I think a lot of that just gave me a lot of practice because again, like they weren't my best grades. I've always been a slow reader, still am. And I've always been a little bit stronger at writing than reading anyway. But I think I got into this, I got older, and the more I practiced with it and wrote, the better I got and started to really see that I had developed some skills and maybe had some natural talent for it. But it wasn't something that I just saw like when I was a kid and just like kind of came naturally to me. So I think we forget that like sometimes it's, you know, maybe your family had a preference for a subject and pushed you in a certain direction, or your friends or your school. Maybe the person beside you seems like a better writer because they've had more writing classes or they've learned skills that you haven't learned yet, not necessarily a nature thing. So I guess for this one, I guess the point that I take away from this is that everybody can learn skills. It's not some like yes or no, black and white, like I'm either good at it or I'm not. Because writing is communicating and communicating isn't everything. So it's important to build at least those communication skills that translate into everything. Myth 5 is good grammar is good writing. I know you've heard this because every student or almost every student I've had has said that like a lot of their workshops in the past, if they had them, were mostly about looking for grammar. But I will say this, like grammar matters, but it's one thing of many. It's not a make or break thing. There are lots of things that can make or break a piece. Like if you can't figure out what it's about, it's unconvincing, has terrible evidence, is supposed to be engaging, but it's not, and you couldn't make it all, your audience can't make it all the way through it. The thoughts are disorganized, it rambles, goes off onto tangents, has poor examples. There's all kinds of things that can make or break things. So it isn't just grammar. I think we tend to say like grammar is the backbone and grammar makes you a good writer. But I know lots of good writers that are not strong grammarians. That's why they have editors. Until I had to teach a grammar class in like my early 20s, I had never learned an actual grammar rule. I didn't take a grammar class like since like elementary school. I knew nouns and verbs, and maybe if you asked me what a preposition was, I would have gotten it. But that was about it. But I still had pretty good grammar because I had read and written a lot, and I had a feel for how things should sound and what they should look like. So I could tell you that something was wrong, but not why until I had to teach the class and I had to read the textbook. But again, it's one skill of many, and even in different majors, sometimes grammar is valued differently, and there can even be different grammar rules and changes in grammar rules depending on what field you're in. the 5 paragraph essay. I don't, and I would love to hear some people like, I guess, tell me whether or not this is still a huge experience, a huge part of like high school. I find that a lot of people do still write these in high school a good bit, and they do have some foundational things. I think that they do help give you a sense of overall, like how to organize, how to have a focus, like thesis statement, how to organize like subpoints and wrap up your essay and things like that. And they make great like go-to formulas for like essay tests and things. But I think once you get into college, people realize, if they haven't already, that like it's just like one style. It's just one style. And once the papers get longer and more complicated, 5 paragraphs just doesn't cut it. So I think that people kind of learn that on their own. Myth 7, never use I. This is one I know a lot of people have had a lot of experience with, because they think like good academic writing is always formal, always objective. So it should always have personal, like avoid personal experiences, personal pronouns, that kind of stuff. But I will say this, like if you are writing in the humanities, personal experience is pretty common, and personal experience is actually one type of evidence or one thing that you can include when you're writing about something to build credibility and connect with your audience. And personal pronouns are the same way. Like you can't, I would wager that a lot of the writing that you read on a day-to-day basis has a lot of personal pronouns in it. And I've read a lot of articles by scholars that have personal pronouns and personal experience. Again, that's not all writing. If you have a lab, you're writing a lab report, you're writing in a certain genre, they are going to want it to be objective and passive and avoid personal pronouns. So I think that it's not that you should use I or that you shouldn't use I. It's that you have to pay attention to whether or not it's appropriate and accepted in the genre that you happen to be writing in and the field that you're in, whether or not that's considered okay and whether or not that's even encouraged in the major or the type of writing that you're doing. So these are the 7 myths that I wanted to talk about. And I would like for you now to go to the Padlet, and you can either post a short video, or you can write a response and reply to 2 people. But your post needs to be about at least 2 of these myths and experiences that you've had. And I think hopefully maybe you'll find that like a lot of people have had maybe some similar experiences, and then you're going to move on to the next and final activity of this session. Peace.